For Network Africa today, Cameroon's President Paul Biya announces plans for major talks to end the conflict in the English-speaking regions of the country. Zimbabwe announces plans to evacuate 171 people from South Africa over rising xenophobic violence. Former South African President Jacob Zuma is in danger of losing his controversial rural home in Nkandla after failing to keep up with loan repayments. Hello, welcome to the program. I am Amarachi Ubani. We begin today in Cameroon, where in a rare address to the nation, President Paul Biya has announced plans to hold major talks to end the conflict in the English-speaking regions of the country, where separatist fighters are demanding independence. The two Anglophone regions argue they have been marginalized for decades by the central government and the French-speaking majority. Mr. Biya outlined measures to quell the crisis, which began 3 years ago when lawyers and teachers in the northwest and the southwest regions went on strike over attempts to impose French in schools and courts. The 86-year-old leader says talks would be chaired by the Prime Minister and would include politicians, armed groups and victims. Mr. Biya, who has been in power since 1982, also says consultations will be held before talks begin at the end of the month. Since the crisis turned violent in 2017, it is estimated that nearly 2,000 people have been killed and more than 500,000 forced from their homes. Back here in Nigeria, the Presidential Election Tribunal sitting in Abuja has been reading judgment in the petition filed by the People's Democratic Party and its candidate Atiku Abubakar challenging the election of President Muhammadu Buhari. The tribunal further struck out the suit seeking disqualification of Mr. Atiku on allegations of being a Cameroonian citizen. Mr. Buhari, in his reply to Atiku's petition seeking his disqualification for not possessing prerequisite academic qualifications for the office of president, had urged the court to disqualify him, as Mr. Atiku, on the grounds that he was not a Nigerian. According to Mr. Buhari and the APC, Jeddah, the place of Mr. Atiku's birth in 1946, belonged to Cameroon and not part of northern Nigeria. However, in its ruling, the court held that the respondents ought to file a cross-petition against the qualification of Mr. Atiku for the February 23rd poll and not to use it as defense. At the commencement of the sitting today, the tribunal dismissed a preliminary objection filed by INEC seeking a dismissal of the petition of the PDP and its presidential candidate for failure to join the vice president as a party in the suit, having participated in the election that is subject of the appeal. The tribunal also dismissed an application by INEC seeking the disqualification of Mr. Atiku's counsel, Dr. Livinus Uzokwu. INEC's counsel, Ustaz Yunus Usman, had argued that the processes endorsed by Mr. Uzokwu were invalid because he was not a lawyer known to the Nigerian judiciary. However, the chairman of the tribunal, Justice Muhammad Garba, noted that the petitioner's counsel, in his counter-affidavit, proved beyond doubt that Uzokwu is a legal practitioner. Meanwhile, the tribunal struck out the paragraphs in the petition wherein the petitioners alleged that there was arrest, harassment, intimidation, and so on by the Nigerian police. Justice Garba agreed with the INEC lawyer that for such a serious allegation against the police, they ought to have been joined as a party in the suit. The tribunal also denies INEC's request to dismiss Mr. Abubakar's prayer seeking President Buhari's disqualification on the ground that he was not qualified to contest the election. The panel also dismissed the contention by President Buhari that Mr. Atiku Abubakar did not qualify to file the petition is dismissed by the tribunal. Mr. Buhari, in his reply to Mr. Atiku's petition seeking his disqualification for not possessing prerequisite academic qualifications for the office of president, had urged the court to disqualify Mr. Atiku on the grounds that he was not Nigerian. In the meantime, over 178 Nigerians are on board the Air Peace flight evacuating South Africa because of the xenophobic attacks in the country. The Air Peace flight MEN 2759 was expected to leave the OR Tambo International Airport at 9 a.m., but as at 2 p.m. local time, immigration it was delayed, beg your pardon, due to some documentation challenges and rigorous immigration procedures. Many of those on board are those who voluntarily are returning to Nigeria following the xenophobic attacks in the past few weeks. They came out in large numbers as early as 4 in the morning outside the missions to join the buses ferrying them to the airport. The flight is expected to land at the Murtala Muhammad International Airport in Lagos at 11:15 p.m.
We never see shame.
They were first sent off with a prayer by the Consul General, Godwin Adama, and the process soon began. As early as 4 a.m. local time, the evacuees were already gathered outside Nigeria's missions in the country, here in Johannesburg at the Consulate General and in Pretoria, Nigeria's High Commission, for the journey back to Nigeria. First, the roll call was taken and they all proceeded into the coaches here provided by the missions to take them to the...
Kelvin James.
Kelvin Gates.
Jonas Oluwabumi. Jonas Oluwabumi.
Bring
out your passport and don't delay us.
Okay, let him enter.
Save for a few documentation issues, and the ones who defy the two-piece 32 kg luggage specification all seemed smooth sailing.
The evacuation has been going very well, and we are satisfied with the response of Nigerians, those who are willing to go.
One after the other, the coaches left for the airport. Some of those left behind didn't take the goodbye too well. Lorraine, a psychologist, is a South African. Her partner of a few years left with this first batch. She didn't want to be identified.
It is a very sad day here today because lots of people don't understand the lives of some of the South African women who got married to these Nigerians. They got good homes, they got good families, they've provided for. And most of the South African women are struggling out there. This is the sad thing of the event of what happened here. I think that the idea of just blaming the Nigerians for everything that happened here and they had to take the blame for it was really, really unfair.
The Air Peace flight MEN 2759 landed on time in South Africa, but the processing of passengers took much more time than expected. From those whose record of entry into the Republic could not be found, to those who didn't have the required documents to travel with children. Some issues were resolved, while some passengers were turned back. But those who made it on the flight were glad.
To my shop on Monday, before I reached here, nothing. Everything was gone. In Julie's by Marvel, nothing there. I can't take pain inside my shop. So I'm happy to go. I want to leave this stupid country. I'm happy.
At the boarding gate, they showed some Nigerian spirit. A second flight is expected on Thursday, the 12th of September, to take the next batch of evacuees home. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Betty Dibia, Channels Television News.
Also planning evacuations from South Africa is Zimbabwe. According to the Foreign Minister Sibusiso Moyo, the government is planning to evacuate 171 people from South Africa, including the bodies of 2 people. Moyo added that Harare will escalate the evacuation if the situation deteriorates, is seeking support from international organizations to help those affected. In the last outbreak of xenophobic violence in South Africa, deadly riots last week in Pretoria and Johannesburg killed at least 12 people, including 2 foreigners, and targeted foreign-owned businesses. The body of former leader Robert Mugabe has arrived back in Zimbabwe after a private flight from Singapore where he died last week at the age of 95, left off. Mr. Mugabe was Zimbabwe's first leader after the country became independent in 1980. He held on to power for almost 4 decades before being ousted in a coup in 2017. He will be buried on Sunday after his state funeral on Saturday, but his final resting place remains in doubt. Let's get more on this now from Zimbabwean journalist Nigel Nyamutumbu. Nigel, thank you for joining us on Network Africa. After the return of Mr. Mugabe's body, what happens next? Is there a clearer picture now about where he will be buried, seeing as there's days to the funeral?
Thank you for having me. Well, the latest update that we have from the government of Zimbabwe is that upon arrival, the former president's body will be ferried to his rural home in Zvimba, west of the capital Harare, and will be brought back to Harare tomorrow and Friday. What's really important at this stage is to follow up on a possible meeting between the former First Lady and President Mnangagwa, who are now aware, then political arch rivals, and who up to this day do not really see eye to eye. As they were saying, President Mugabe, former president, died a bitter man, and the former First Lady is also still really bitter about the events of November 2017. So it'll be really interesting to see how they get to meet and when they will actually announce where the body of the former president will be laid to rest. But my gut tells me I think he'll go to the National Heroes Acre, which he not only conceived as an idea, but is the haven of a lot of his comrades and cadres that he worked with before, during, and post the liberation struggle of Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I understand it might be a bit difficult trying to decide there between state and family. But Nigel, do give us a feel of what the mood is like in Zimbabwe at the moment. Is Mr. Mugabe still being seen as a hero or a villain? Which one is more?
Well, walking down the streets of Harare, one may be forgiven to think that there is no big event such as a big funeral of someone of former President Mugabe's stature, as everyone is just going through their businesses as pretty much normal. Yes, it's a very topical issue. A lot of people are talking about it, but you have a sense that people feel a little indifferent towards Mugabe. But suffice to say, the mainstream opposition political party in Zimbabwe that was scheduled to have their anniversary celebrations on Saturday have deferred their celebrations in honor of President Mugabe, something that may indicate that he has been accorded some level of respect from within the opposition circles. There has been some talk by ordinary Zimbabweans that they would attend his funeral. So I guess people are waiting for the body to arrive for there to really have a feel or that there is such a landmark event as the death of Africa, one of Africa's longest ruling leaders, Robert Mugabe.
Indeed. But let's talk about the xenophobic violence in South Africa, Zimbabwe's neighbor. We understand the government of Zimbabwe is planning to evacuate at least 171 nationals from South Africa. What more do we know about this?
The latest that is coming from South Africa is that it is, in fact, the South African government that has given foreign nationals residing in the country, in South Africa, that they've been given two options: either to be repatriated to their respective countries, a process in which would involve their host government, or be taken to safer places. With Zimbabwean government will obviously then be
party to repatriating the repatriation of the Zimbabwean nationals that are residing in South Africa. But on itself, we haven't really had something official from the government of Zimbabwe taking the initiative of taking the Zimbabweans that are residing in South Africa back home. Suffice to say that the Bay Bridge border that borders Zimbabwe and South Africa has now just been increasingly busier with government making sure that they process the entry and the return of Zimbabweans from South Africa that have been affected by the xenophobic attacks. But one would hope.
Nigel, thanks again for joining us on Network Africa. Appreciate your reporting on the issue. And we'll be on top of that story, the burial arrangements for the former Zimbabwean president. But still to come on the program, South Sudan's President Salva Kiir and rebel leader Riek Machar agree to form a transitional government by the middle of November. Stay with us.